Out of all modern American V8s out there, the Ford Coyote is arguably the best of them all. It's super efficient, it's very advanced, and it makes a ton of power per liter, especially compared to something like the GM LS, which is a great engine in its own right, but it doesn't have the same power potential, if you will, of the Ford Coyote. The only problem is not all Coyotes are the same. You've got a few different generations and a few different variants within those generations. And more specifically, there's a F-150 and a Mustang version of the Coyote. And a lot of people want to know what the difference is because they are really similar, but they're not exactly the same. So let's dive in and find out which one is better. Right off the bat, it's kind of obvious that the Ford Mustang Coyote makes more power than the Ford F-150 Coyote. And across the board, there's about a 30 to 40 horsepower peak difference between the two. Now that's at the absolute peak. Peak torque is really close between the two. It's definitely not that drastic, but the big change between the two is the area under the curve. So how much low end and mid-range torque the F-150 engine produces compared to the Mustang engine. For the Mustang, peak power occurs around 6,500 RPM, where the F-150 is around 5,750 RPM. Equally as important, peak torque on the F-150 is about 500 RPM lower than it is on the Mustang. Based on the use cases for each application, this makes sense since you want as much low-end power as possible for towing and hauling. Ford changed the peak torque of these two variants through camshafts, internals, intake manifolds, exhaust manifolds, and tuning. Now, starting from the top down, we can look at the intake manifold first. As far as I can tell, the F-150 intake manifold is almost identical to the Mustang, and in fact, some sources say it is absolutely identical, but there are a lot of sources that claim that the F-150 intake manifold sits just a little bit higher, which indicates the possibility of longer intake runners. It's also worth noting that the F-150 intake manifold is gray, where on the Mustang it's black. Before you go ripping me apart in the comments telling me that the F-150 and the Mustang intake are identical, just know that Justin Starkley of VMP Performance is a guy who tested a bunch of different Coyote intake manifolds and put them into one comparison. He's the one who said that the F-150 intake manifold does have longer intake runners and produces more low-end torque. Size, shape, and length of the intake port can have a very big effect on air velocity, and it really affects the power curve. And obviously, since the F-150 is going to be set up for more low-end torque, the intake manifold is set up for more low-end torque. It's designed to produce more low-end power compared to the GT manifold. It's also worth noting that of all the OEM Coyote intake manifolds, the 2018 Plus Mustang intake manifold offers the best performance for the money spent, even competing with the Cobra Jet intake manifold, which is literally designed specifically for race use. But the OEM intake manifold of the 2018 Coyote is almost exactly the same in terms of performance. Moving on to the camshafts, it's basically more of the same, where the F-150 is set up to have more low-end torque than the Mustang. And Ford did this by changing the intake camshafts and giving them less duration on the F-150 compared to the Mustang, but the exhaust camshafts are left the same. With the intake valves closing sooner, there is increased cranking pressure, which theoretically helps improve low-end torque. Ford's variable cam timing system, also known as TI-VCT, can be found on both engines, which allows for a massive amount of change in valve overlap. An area that's kind of gray is the differences in tuning. And I couldn't really find any clear answers on how Ford tuned the TI-VCT system on the F-150 compared to the Mustang to make more low-end torque. So if anybody is able to find clear answers on how Ford tunes their variable cam timing systems, please let me know down in the comments below. The last major difference that you'll find on top of these engines is the exhaust manifold, where on the Mustang you have a stainless steel exhaust manifold, and on the F-150 you have a cast iron exhaust manifold. And this makes sense because the Mustang is a performance application. Stainless steel is quite a bit lighter than cast iron, so the headers on the Mustang are going to be way lighter than the headers on the F-150. And it's also worth noting that cast iron headers are typically cheaper to manufacture. Depending on the generation of Coyote that you're looking at, compression is different. On the early Coyote motors, the Mustang had an 11:1 compression ratio, and the F-150s had a 10.5:1 compression ratio. That's since changed on the Gen 3 to 12:1 compression ratio across the board, partially thanks to the addition of direct injection for both versions. Other changes include the F-150's front-mounted oil cooler, less robust oil pump gears, and lack of a windage tray. The timing cover is also ribbed, and the alternator location is also different as well. When it all comes down to it, these two motors are incredibly similar, and really the performance numbers show that. These two motors are very, very similar, and basically the only differences between the two are the intake manifold, the intake camshafts, the tuning, and the exhaust manifolds. Other than that, they are nearly identical. While the F-150 Coyote might make a little bit less power, it is arguably the more popular motor for motor swaps because of the fact that it's cheaper to source. There's a bazillion F-150s out there with Coyote motors, and you're probably going to be able to find one cheaper than you could find a wrecked Mustang with Coyote motor. And if you wanted to make an F-150 Coyote perform similar to a Mustang Coyote, all you really need to do is tuning, intake manifolds, and camshafts, and with that you could even way outperform a stock Mustang Coyote. So, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please smash the thumbs up button because it really helps me out. Get subscribed so you don't miss out on future videos. Drop a comment down below letting me know if I missed anything and what videos you want to see in the future, and I'll see you guys in the next one.